The Perfect Warriors. From the personal archives of High Chronicler Ventar, last of the Elver War Council. Translated from Old Alvar, Earth date, 2487. In the vast expanse of our galaxy, there exists a peculiar tendency among advanced civilizations to mistake technological superiority for absolute superiority. We, the Elver, were perhaps the greatest example of this fatal conceit. For 3,000 years, we had engineered ourselves into what we believed was perfection incarnate. Every Elver warrior was a masterpiece of genetic manipulation, every movement calculated, every response optimized. We were living weapons, and we were proud of it. I remember the day everything changed with perfect clarity. How could I not? It was encoded into my enhanced memory with the same precision that marked every aspect of our existence. I was there in the grand arena of Kelvaster when Sergeant Nathan Victus of Earth stepped onto the sacred sands, a mere human facing what we all believed would be certain death. The arena itself was a testament to Elver engineering, a massive structure that could hold over 500,000 spectators, its force fields precisely calibrated to contain the violence within while allowing every witness to see and hear everything with perfect clarity. The environmental controls maintained optimal conditions for combat, and the quantum-linked broadcasting systems ensured that billions across our empire would witness this latest demonstration of Elver superiority. I sat in the War Council's observation box, alongside my fellow strategists and military leaders. Below us, representatives from our 17 subjugated races filled their designated sections, their expressions ranging from resigned acceptance to barely concealed hatred. The humans, interestingly, had sent fewer than 10,000 observers, though we had allocated them space for 10 times that number. An acknowledgement of their inevitable defeat, Supreme Commander Kelvar had commented with a dismissive wave of his hand. They know their champion stands no chance. I wasn't so certain. Throughout my extensive military career, I had learned that certainty often breeds blindness. The humans' response to our challenge had been peculiar from the start. Their leader, General Mattis, had responded to our invitation with what we interpreted as either ignorance or arrogance. Earth submits to no conqueror or tyrant. What caught my attention even more was their choice of champion. Sergeant Nathan Victus was not their strongest warrior, nor their most decorated. His service record, which I had studied extensively, showed competence but not excellence by their own military standards. He had served in several Earth conflicts, demonstrated good tactical thinking, and maintained peak physical condition, but nothing that should have made him their chosen representative in a battle that would supposedly determine their planet's fate. As I watched him enter the arena that day, I noted everything about him with my enhanced senses. Height, 1.85 meters. Weight, approximately 90 kilograms. Muscle density, high for a human, but nothing compared to an Elver warrior. Heart rate, surprisingly steady for someone walking to their death. He carried traditional weapons, a spear and shield, rather than the firearms his species seemed to favor. His opponent, Subjugator First-Class Male Tooth, was the epitome of Elver genetic engineering. Over 4 centuries old, he had participated in 12 planetary conquests and undergone countless genetic enhancements. His neural pathways had been optimized for combat, his muscles engineered for both speed and power, and his skeleton reinforced with biometallic compounds. He was, by any objective measure, the perfect warrior. The contrast between the two couldn't have been more stark. Maletooth's silver-gray skin gleamed under the arena lights, his movements fluid and precise, each step calculated for maximum efficiency. Victus, with his bronze skin and comparatively crude movements, looked like a relic from a primitive age. Yet something about him made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the way he studied everything around him, his eyes constantly moving, taking in details that should have been meaningless to him. Or maybe it was his stance, not the perfect combat positioning we expected, but something looser, more adaptable. The games began with the traditional ceremony. The arena master's voice boomed across the stadium, introducing the combatants and stating the stakes, though we all knew they were meaningless. This was meant to be an execution, a reminder to all our subjugated races of the futility of resistance. Maeltuff chose his weapons with typical Elver precision, twin pellblades, each the length of a human arm, their monomolecular edges capable of slicing through most materials with minimal resistance. Victus, as noted, stood with his spear and shield, ancient weapons that seemed absurdly primitive in comparison. The first exchanges were predictable. Maeltuff tested his opponent with casual strikes, his movements deliberately slow by Elver standards. Victus defended well enough, his shield intercepting the strikes while his spear maintained distance. To the untrained eye, he might have appeared to be holding his own. I knew better. Or at least, I thought I did. What I didn't understand then, what none of us understood, was that we were watching something unprecedented. We saw a human warrior facing an Elver champion, but we were actually witnessing the first moves in a game whose rules we didn't even know existed. Maeltuff, confident in his superiority, began to play to the crowd. He turned his back on Victus, a deliberate insult that drew cheers from the Elver spectators. "Have you any more?" he called out in the human's direction. "I fear this one may be defective." It was at that moment that I noticed something odd about Victus's fighting style. While Maeltuff had been showing off, the human had been making slight adjustments to his stance, subtle changes in his grip on the spear, minimal shifts in his shield position. None of these movements matched any known combat doctrine in our database. I opened my mouth to say something to my fellow council members, but before I could speak, everything changed. Victus moved. What happened next would be analyzed countless times in the years to come, but in that moment, it was almost too fast to follow, even for our enhanced senses. The human spear thrust came not at Maeltuff's turned back, as expected, but at the arena floor itself. The spear's tip scraped across the sand, sending a spray of particles into the air. To most observers, it must have seemed like a missed opportunity or a sign of poor aim. But I saw Maeltuff's reaction, a slight adjustment in his stance, his enhanced eyes automatically trying to track every grain of sand, his perfect brain attempting to calculate the trajectory of each particle. And in that split second of divided attention, Sergeant Nathan Victus began to teach the Elver Empire its first lesson about the true nature of combat, perfection, and the dangerous assumption that the two were the same thing. The perfect deception. From the personal archives of High Chronicler Ventar, last of the Elver War Council. Translated from Old Alvar, Earth date, 2487. The sand had barely settled when Victus launched his real attack. Later analysis would show that the scattered particles had created exactly 2,374 moving objects in Maeltuff's field of vision. Our perfect warrior's enhanced mind attempted to track each one, his combat algorithms trying to calculate potential threats from every airborne grain. In doing so, he committed the cardinal sin of combat, he fell into his opponent's trap. Victus's shield, previously held in a defensive position, suddenly shot forward. Not as a weapon, but as a mirror. The arena's artificial sun caught its polished surface at precisely the right angle, sending a flash of reflected light directly into Maeltuff's enhanced optical sensors. Our genetic modifications had given us superior vision, but they had also made us more susceptible to sudden changes in light intensity. Where a human's pupils would have naturally contracted, our engineered eyes attempted to analyze and compensate for each individual photon. In that fractional moment of sensory overload, Victus struck. His spear, presumably aimed for a killing thrust, instead swept low, catching Maeltuff behind his right knee. It wasn't a powerful blow, it didn't need to be. The human had somehow identified the exact point where our enhanced leg muscles connected to our reinforced tendons. A strike there wouldn't cause serious damage, but it would trigger an automatic redistribution of balance, another perfect response programmed into our bodies. Maeltuff's body responded exactly as its programming dictated, shifting weight to his other leg to maintain optimal stability. And that's when I understood the true genius of Victus's strategy. He hadn't been trying to harm Maeltuff at all, he was forcing our perfect warrior to follow his perfect programming. The next series of moves happened so quickly that even my enhanced perception struggled to follow them. Victus had already begun his next attack before his first had landed, as if he knew exactly how Maeltooth would respond. The spear shaft struck the Elver's left shoulder, again with minimal force, but at precisely the right angle to trigger another automated response. Maeltooth's arms moved to the exact defensive position they had been programmed to take. In the War Council box, Supreme Commander Kelthar leaned forward, his perfect composure showing the first crack of concern. "Impossible," he muttered. "He's anticipating Maeltooth's responses." But it was worse than that. Victus wasn't just anticipating them, he was counting on them. Each strike seemed deliberately calibrated not to cause damage, but to trigger specific programmed responses. It was like watching someone input a complex code, each tap and strike eliciting an automatic, predetermined reaction. The human strategy became clear to me in that moment, and it was terrifying in its simplicity. During his week of training, he hadn't been preparing to fight an Elver warrior, he had been studying how we moved, how we responded, how our perfect programming controlled our perfect bodies. He had turned our greatest strength into our greatest weakness. Maeltooth, to his credit, realized something was wrong. His conscious mind began trying to override his combat programming, attempting to introduce randomness into his responses. But centuries of genetic optimization and conditioning fought against this improvisation. His body wanted to follow its perfect programming, while his mind struggled to break free of it. The result was devastating. For the first time in my long life, I watched an Elver warrior move with something less than perfect grace. Maeltooth's movements became jerky, caught between programmed responses and conscious control. His twin pell blades, usually flowing in perfect harmony, began to desynchronize. In the stands, a strange silence had fallen over the Elver spectators. The representatives of our subjugated races, however, were beginning to lean forward, their expressions changing from resigned acceptance to something else, something we hadn't seen in centuries. Hope. Victus pressed his advantage, but not in the way any of us expected. Rather than attempting to land a killing blow, he continued his methodical triggering of Maeltooth's programmed responses. Each strike was precisely calculated, each movement deliberately chosen to force another perfect reaction. It was like watching someone play an instrument, only the instrument was our perfect warrior's perfect body. "Stop this!" Maeltooth suddenly roared, his voice carrying an emotion I had never heard from an Elver warrior: frustration. "Fight me properly, human." Victus's response was chilling in its simplicity: "I am." What happened next would change the course of galactic history. Maeltooth, driven to desperation by his inability to break free of his programming, attempted something that went against centuries of genetic conditioning. He tried to shut down all of his combat algorithms at once. In theory, this should have been impossible. Our enhancement protocols had failsafes built upon failsafes to prevent such a dangerous override. But Maeltooth wasn't just any Elver warrior. He had spent centuries adding his own modifications, his own improvements to his already perfect form. In his arrogance, our arrogance, he had created backdoors in his own programming, ways to push beyond even our species' limitations. Now, he attempted to use these backdoors to free himself from the very perfection that had defined his existence. The result was catastrophic. As Maeltooth's consciousness fought against his programming, his neural networks began to overload. His enhanced muscles received conflicting signals, causing them to lock and spasm. His perfect balance wavered. His enhanced senses, suddenly receiving unfiltered data, overwhelmed his cognitive functions. Victus stood back, lowering his weapons. He didn't need to strike the killing blow, Maeltooth's own perfection was destroying him from within. The mighty Elver warrior collapsed to his knees, his pell blades clattering to the arena floor. His silver-gray skin began to mottle as his regulatory systems failed. His enhanced muscles, still receiving conflicting signals, began to tear themselves apart. In the stands, the silence had become absolute. We were witnessing something that had not occurred in over 6 centuries, an Elver warrior's defeat. But this was more than a defeat. This was the shattering of everything we thought we knew about combat, about perfection, about superiority. As medical teams rushed to the arena floor, I looked at the human warrior. Sergeant Victus hadn't moved, his stance still casual, his breathing remarkably steady for someone who had just accomplished the impossible. His eyes met mine across the distance, and in that moment, I understood something that would haunt me for centuries to come. This hadn't been a battle between a human warrior and an Elver champion. This had been a test, and we had failed it spectacularly. But as I would soon learn, this was only the beginning. The real test, and the real war, was about to begin. And nothing in our perfect programming had prepared us for what was coming. The perfect storm. From the personal archives of High Chronicler Ventar, last of the Elver War Council. Translated from Old Alvar, Earth date, 2487. The aftermath of the arena battle sent shockwaves through the Elver Empire. Within hours of Maeltuft's defeat, our quantum networks were flooded with analyses, theories, and increasingly desperate attempts to explain how a primitive human had defeated our perfect warrior. The War Council convened an emergency session, and I found myself at the center of a storm that would reshape our understanding of both humanity and ourselves. But the true magnitude of what had happened wouldn't become clear until 3 days after the battle, when we received simultaneous reports from 17 different sectors of our empire. On each of our subjugated worlds, the local populations had begun acting differently. Not in open rebellion, that we could have understood and crushed. No, this was something far more subtle and, in retrospect, far more dangerous. They were watching us. Studying us. Just as Sergeant Victus had done. The humans have taught them how to see our weaknesses, Supreme Commander Keldar raged during one council session. This must be answered with immediate and overwhelming force. But Junior Counselor Sintera, barely a century old and considered barely more than a child by our standards, raised an interesting point. If they've already identified our weaknesses, she asked, wouldn't a show of force simply give them more opportunities to study our response patterns? The silence that followed her question was deafening. She was right, of course, and that realization sent ripples of unease through our perfect minds. Every action we might take, every response we might make, all of it would be analyzed, catalogued, and potentially used against us. It was during this period of paralysis that we received a transmission from Earth. Not from their military command this time, but from an institution they called Harvard University. It was a formal request for cultural exchange. They wanted to send students to study our society. A transparent attempt at infiltration, Keldar dismissed it. Then why announce it so openly? I countered. Why not simply insert covert observers? The answer came to me even as I asked the question. They wanted us to know they were watching. They wanted us to feel the weight of their observation. Just as Victus had announced his presence in the arena, humanity was announcing its intention to study us. But the true masterstroke became apparent when similar requests began arriving from our subjugated worlds. If we denied Earth's request while continuing to allow our existing subjects their limited rights of movement within the Empire, we would be tacitly admitting that humans posed a unique threat. If we denied all such requests, we would have to fundamentally reshape our entire imperial structure. And all the while, they would be watching our decision-making process, learning how we responded to diplomatic pressures. It was around this time that we discovered something else, something that should have been obvious from the start. We began analyzing records of human conflicts, not just their battles but their games. What we found was astonishing. Humans had developed thousands of different combat styles, fighting techniques, and strategic approaches. Where we had sought the one perfect way to fight, they had cultivated endless variation. But it went deeper than that. Their entertainment, what they called sports, often involved deliberately imposing limitations on themselves. They would create arbitrary rules, handicaps, and restrictions, then figure out how to triumph within those constraints. While we had spent millennia pursuing perfect optimization, they had spent their history exploring endless adaptation. The implications were staggering. Sergeant Victus's victory wasn't just a clever exploitation of our programming, it was the product of a species that had turned adaptation itself into an art form. This revelation led to another, even more disturbing discovery. We began reviewing the psychological profiles of our subjugated races, comparing their behavior before and after human contact. The changes were subtle but undeniable. They were beginning to experiment, to try new approaches, to adapt. Humanity hadn't just taught them how to see our weaknesses, they had taught them how to think differently. The crisis came to a head when we received reports of a peculiar new game spreading through the lower levels of our capital world. Children of various subjugated races had begun playing something they called Mirror the Elver. At first glance, it appeared to be simple mockery. They would imitate our perfect posture, our precise movements, our calculated responses. But watching recordings of these games, I noticed something chilling. They weren't just imitating us. They were cataloging us. Each movement, each response, each pattern was being observed, recorded, and shared. A new generation was growing up learning to see through our perfection to the patterns that lay beneath. In response, the War Council made what would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. We ordered an immediate empire-wide prohibition on such imitative games. The response was exactly what humanity must have expected. Our perfect enforcement of this rule revealed even more of our patterns, our priorities, our programming. It was during this period that I received an unexpected visitor. A human cultural attaché named Dr. Sarah Chen requested a meeting to discuss historical preservation. Her credentials were impeccable, her manner respectful, her questions seemingly innocent. But throughout our conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that every word I spoke, every gesture I made, was being added to humanity's growing catalog of elver behaviors. "Your species' achievements are remarkable," she told me near the end of our meeting. It would be a tragedy if they were lost to time. Only later did I understand the layers of meaning in her words. They weren't just studying us, they were archiving us. Like archaeologists documenting a civilization on the brink of transformation. But the true revelation came that evening, as I reviewed our conversation. Dr. Chen had displayed subtle variations in her behavior throughout our meeting, minor changes in posture, tiny shifts in speech patterns. At the time, I had attributed this to human imperfection. Now I realized she had been testing different approaches, gauging my responses to each variation. Even in a simple diplomatic meeting, they were gathering data, learning, adapting. And then came the message that would change everything. A simple transmission from Earth, broadcast on all frequencies, meant to be heard by every species in the galaxy. To all sentient beings, the following educational materials are being made freely available. What followed would shake the foundations of our empire and force us to confront the true nature of perfection itself. The Perfect Lesson. From the personal archives of High Chronicler Ventar, last of the Elver War Council. Translated from Old Alvar, Earth date, 2487. The contents of humanity's transmission changed everything. It wasn't a declaration of war. It wasn't a demand for independence. It was something far more devastating, a curriculum. They called it the Adaptive Archives, and it contained detailed documentation of every failed approach, every dead end, and every mistake humanity had made throughout its history. Combat techniques that hadn't worked. Strategies that had backfired. Innovations that had fallen short. All meticulously catalogued, analyzed, and explained. At first, we didn't understand the significance. Supreme Commander Kelvar actually laughed when he first reviewed the contents. "They're sharing their failures," he scoffed. "Perhaps defeat has driven them mad." But I had begun to understand humanity's true nature, and I saw what others didn't. This wasn't just a catalogue of failures, it was a roadmap of adaptation. Each failed approach had led to new insights, each mistake had sparked innovation, each dead end had forced them to find new paths. The impact was immediate and devastating. Across our empire, subjugated species began experimenting with these failed approaches, but not to replicate them. They were using them as starting points, adapting and modifying them based on their own unique characteristics and circumstances. A particularly illuminating example came from the Zorkath, a species we had conquered centuries ago. Their natural crystalline structure had made them particularly susceptible to our sonic weapons. Now, using principles derived from humanity's failed experiments with acoustic harmonics, they began developing new forms of movement that actually used our sonic attacks to power their own counterstrikes. This pattern repeated across our empire. The Mirian swarm colonies adapted failed human swarm tactics into something entirely new. The photosynthetic Valran modified abandoned human light-based weapons into systems that could turn our own enhanced vision against us. But the true masterpiece of humanity's strategy became clear when we discovered that different species were sharing their adaptations with each other. They had created what they called the Adaptation Network, a constantly evolving database of innovations, modifications, and discoveries. During an emergency war council session, Junior Counselor Sintera made an observation that chilled us all: they're not just teaching others to adapt. They're teaching them to teach adaptation. She was right. Humanity hadn't just shared their knowledge, they had shared their entire process of learning and innovation. They had turned adaptation itself into a contagious idea. The implication struck me with terrible clarity. Our pursuit of perfection had led us to create a single, optimized approach to everything. But in doing so, we had become predictable. More than that, we had become vulnerable to anyone who could recognize and exploit our patterns. This revelation led to a crisis within the Elver military command. Some advocated for immediate and overwhelming military action to crush this growing network of adaptation. Others argued for a complete withdrawal and isolation while we developed new, less predictable combat protocols. But we had spent too long pursuing perfection. Our entire society, our very biology, was built around the idea of optimal responses. We couldn't simply choose to be unpredictable, our programming wouldn't allow it. It was during this period of crisis that we intercepted a transmission between Earth and one of our subjugated worlds. It was a simple message, but its contents revealed the final piece of humanity's strategy. The transmission contained only two things: a recording of Sergeant Victus's arena battle with Male Tooth, and a single question. "What do you see?" That's when I understood the true purpose of the arena battle. It had never been about winning. Victus could have likely defeated Male Tooth in other ways. Humans, we had learned, were remarkably resourceful in combat. But he had chosen to win in a way that demonstrated something specific: perfection could be predicted, and anything that could be predicted could be defeated. The arena battle hadn't been a fight for Earth's freedom. It had been a lesson plan. A proof of concept. A demonstration that even the most perfect system could be understood, analyzed, and overcome. And now, that lesson was spreading across the galaxy. The crisis reached its peak when we began receiving reports of unprecedented phenomena across our empire. Subjugated species were developing hybrid techniques that shouldn't have been possible. They were combining failed human approaches with elements of Elver combat doctrine, creating something entirely new. But the most terrifying development came from within our own ranks. Younger Elver, those who had witnessed Victus's victory and its aftermath, began asking questions that threatened the very foundation of our society. What if perfection isn't about finding the optimal solution? What if perfection is the ability to keep improving? What if we've been pursuing the wrong kind of perfect? These questions led to the first schism in Elver society in over a millennium. The younger generation began experimenting with their own adaptations, deliberately introducing variations into their programming, seeking ways to become less predictable. The old guard, led by Supreme Commander Kelthar, saw this as corruption of our perfect nature and demanded immediate action to stop the spread of what they called adaptive contamination. But they had already lost, and I knew it. Humanity's greatest weapon hadn't been Sergeant Victus, or their archive of failures, or even their network of adaptation. Their greatest weapon had been an idea, that perfection without adaptation was just stagnation. As I watched our perfect empire begin to fracture and transform, I received one final transmission from Earth. It was from General Mattis himself, and contained only a few words. Ready for the next lesson? The perfect evolution. From the personal archives of High Chronicler Ventar, last of the Elver War Council. Translated from Old Alvar, Earth date, 2487. Looking back now, across the centuries that have passed since humanity's next lesson, I understand that we never really had a choice. The moment Sergeant Victus stepped into that arena, our empire's fate was sealed. Not because of his victory, but because of what that victory revealed about the fundamental nature of existence itself. The next phase of humanity's plan unfolded with the same methodical precision that Victus had shown in the arena. Earth began offering what they called exchange programs, opportunities for various species, including the Elver, to visit Earth and study at their institutions. Many of our younger generation immediately volunteered, despite the protests of our conservative leadership. What they found on Earth shattered every preconception we had about humanity. Their cities were chaos made manifest, a riot of different architectural styles, constantly being torn down and rebuilt. Their technology was a mess of competing standards and systems, with older methods existing alongside newer ones. Their combat training facilities taught hundreds of different fighting styles, many of which seemed to directly contradict each other. But amid this chaos, our young people discovered something we had forgotten over our millennia of pursuing perfection: the joy of discovery. I remember receiving a message from Sintera, who had gone to Earth as part of the first exchange group. They have this concept, she wrote, called learning through play. Their children spend years doing activities with no practical purpose, simply to explore possibilities. It's inefficient, illogical, and absolutely brilliant. The humans, we learned, had organized their entire society around the principle of controlled chaos. They deliberately maintained multiple competing systems for everything: government, education, economy, military doctrine, not because they couldn't determine which was best, but because they believed the competition itself drove innovation. But the true masterstroke of their strategy became clear when they introduced what they called the Galactic Innovation Network. It was an extension of their adaptation network, but with a crucial difference. Instead of just sharing knowledge, it created direct connections between different species, encouraging them to collaborate on solving problems. The results were extraordinary. The crystalline Zorkath began working with the photosynthetic Valran to develop entirely new forms of energy manipulation. The Mirian swarm colonies collaborated with Earth's artificial intelligence researchers to create new forms of distributed consciousness. Each species brought its unique perspectives and abilities, creating combinations that none could have achieved alone. And the humans? They were everywhere, not leading but facilitating, not teaching but encouraging exploration. They had turned the galaxy into a vast laboratory of evolution and innovation. The crisis point for our empire came not from external pressure, but from within. A group of young Elver scientists, led by Sintera, made a stunning announcement. They had discovered that our pursuit of genetic perfection had actually introduced a fatal flaw into our species. Our perfect programming, designed to maintain optimal performance, was preventing our genes from naturally evolving. We had become so perfect that we could no longer adapt to changing circumstances. Without intervention, our species would eventually become extinct, unable to cope with the natural variations in the galaxy. The revelation split our society. The Old Guard, led by Supreme Commander Kelthar, called for the scientists' arrest and the immediate cessation of all genetic research. But they found their orders, for the first time in our history, being questioned and debated rather than instantly obeyed. The younger generation, armed with both human adaptive principles and our own technological expertise, proposed a radical solution. Instead of pursuing a single perfect form, we could create a system of controlled genetic variation. Each generation would be slightly different, maintaining our core strengths while allowing for natural adaptation and evolution. The debate raged for months, nearly leading to civil war. In the end, it was a demonstration that decided the matter. Sintera and her team had been working with human scientists to develop what they called dynamic optimization, a system that combined our pursuit of perfection with humanity's embrace of adaptation. They unveiled their work in the same arena where Victus had fought Maeltooth. A young Elver warrior, using their new protocols, demonstrated combat capabilities that exceeded our traditional standards while remaining unpredictable and adaptive. More importantly, the system allowed for continuous improvement, not toward a fixed point of perfection, but toward an ever-evolving state of enhancement. The old guard's resistance crumbled in the face of undeniable evidence. Our society began a dramatic transformation, moving from a rigid hierarchy based on perfect compliance to a more dynamic system that valued innovation and adaptation alongside optimization. As I write these words, centuries later, the galaxy is unrecognizable from what it was before humanity's lessons. The former Elver Empire has evolved into the Galactic Cooperative of Adaptive Species. Our once subjugated races are now partners in an ever-evolving dance of mutual advancement. Humanity, true to their nature, never sought to rule this new order. Instead, they continue to play their chosen role, instigators of change, catalysts of adaptation, teachers who prefer to guide rather than instruct. And Sergeant Nathan Victus? He declined all honors and returned to Earth, but his legacy lives on. The arena where he fought has been transformed into the galaxy's premier research institution, dedicated to the study of adaptation and evolution. Its motto, appropriately enough, is a quote from his post-battle report. Perfection isn't a destination. It's the courage to keep changing. As for me, I have lived long enough to see my own perfect programming gradually give way to something new. My memories remain precise, but my perspectives shift and evolve. I find myself, even now, adapting to new ideas, exploring new possibilities. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I think back to that day in the arena, when a single human showed us that our greatest strength was actually our greatest weakness. We thought we were teaching the galaxy about perfection. Instead, humanity taught us all about something far more important, the perfect imperfection of endless possibility. End of Chronicle.